My guest is here. We are joined with the man himself, Ajamu Baraka. Man, I am so glad that you can join me on this. I've never had you on the show. I've always wanted you on the show. So when you responded favorably to the email, I felt some kind of way. I was like, oh, that's great. How you doing? You doing okay this morning?
I can't complain. I can't complain. I mean, I'm at that point, when the old folks say that when you wake up in the morning, it's a good day. So it's always a good day for me when I'm here. I can
You
join
are
you
you
and
are not
engage
that
in this
old.
important conversation.
Yeah, you are not that old, but I appreciate it. I do appreciate it. And just for the audience, Ajamu Baraka, he's an international human rights activist, organizer, political analyst, national organizer for Black Alliance for Peace. I am deeply appreciative that you are here. Let me get your take on the Trump thing before we move to Venezuela and Colombia. I mean, obviously, Trump has been murdering Colombians and Venezuelans and calling them drug dealers in order to co-sign the fact that they're being murdered. We can jump to that in a moment. But just to piggyback on what I was pointing out about this kind of the weirdness, the bluff of tomahawks. And maybe it was a bluff, maybe it wasn't. It could have been a trial balloon, it could have been a bluff. But then the back down after the 2.5 hour conversation with Putin, the humiliation of Zelensky, again, coming to the White House, only be told no. It's like you made me come all the way from Ukraine and tell me no on a grand stage in this way. Yes, he did. What do you think was going on with that? I'm just curious on your take.
It's really I oppose the simplistic analysis of some people advance that Trump is just a moron. I mean, he is to a certain extent, and that there's no logic to what he and his administration are attempting to do. But what we do see, I think, is a lack of coherence in their approaches, and he seems not to either understand or care that when he utters certain things, it has international implications, and he continues to make comments that then once the moment passes and he's reminded of the objective limitations, he's enforced to walk back.
Yep.
So, this notion of playing with the idea of providing tomahawks, and most people who were serious knew that that wasn't really going to happen. That would be a step basically too far. It caused them to have to then retreat. And as you said, it's almost like stringing along Zelensky. I mean, everybody knows the war is finished, that these young men are being sacrificed weekly. In that case, Trump is in fact correct. Losing their lives for what? This is not going to end in a way that's going to be favorable to the what exists or what remains of the Ukrainian state. So the sooner you get it over with, the better. But because of domestic politics, because of issues of ego, this thing is being strung along. So, it's a very dangerous game that the U.S. is playing, and Trump is very reckless and ill-disciplined with the use of his rhetoric. And this is another case where we see a dangerous situation potentially evolving, but with the steady leadership and influence of Putin and others, it was walked back.
What do you say to people who say Putin's pragmatism is a weakness? Like that, because I can make an argument that yes, Putin has kept us out of a larger war. Agreed. 1,000% agreed. And if 5 years pass and we're still here because the world hasn't
Yeah.
necessarily gone to a nuclear war, it's like, okay, good. Putin did a good job. He was right, right? But there's another argument that can be made, um, in this temporal space where we haven't made it to 5 years yet, that the very act of the pragmatism is what allows him to be tested in this way. Like, meaning, if obviously, if Putin is pushed into a corner, any world leader of a great power that's pushed into a corner is going to respond. But an
Yeah.
argument can be made that maybe you won't get to that response of being pushed into a corner if you are a bit more of a hard ass before you get to that point. And, I don't know the conversation Trump had with Putin. Putin might have told him, we will declare war in real terms if you do that, meaning we will destroy Ukraine, which is what Financial Times pointed out. that Putin said he would destroy Ukraine if this war keeps going. What Putin might have told him is, if you give those tomahawks, we would declare war. This would not be a special military operation. This would be an outright war, and we would decimate Ukraine, which may be what Financial Times is being translated as being filtered through Donald Trump. Is that the guy who's needed? Meaning, it's very possible that Trump was serious about the tomahawks, that it was the conversation that made him back down. I don't know which one it is. It could be Trump is crazy enough to do it, right? And so it could have been a trial balloon. What is the Russian response going to be? Or it could have been completely a bluff. Either way, he had to walk it back. Is this the guy who would be better off, meaning the Putin who's more of a hard ass, as opposed to the one that's more pragmatic, that continuously get tested by NATO? Which one? I'm curious on your take on this.
Let me make 2 points before we get to that very important element. One, I don't think that in the private conversation that he would threaten possibility of all-out war on the United States. Now,
not on the U.S., on Ukraine.
I mean, on Ukraine. I mean, the effect would be about the same, of course, but I don't think that would be the threat. Secondly, I think that let me go straight to the question. The pragmatic. I think you raise a very important point, and I think what we have seen in the last few years with the Russian Federation is that they have recognized that kind of pragmatism is informed by what? A sense of there's a common commitment to reason.
Right.
I think that both the Russians and the Chinese have finally come to the conclusion that they might not always be dealing with rational actors in the upper echelons of decision making within the United States of America, and so they have adjusted their approaches to that reality. So, it is and it was, I think, a weakness in the past. I think in the negotiations with the Biden administration leading up to the special military action, there was a real belief that the Biden administration would adhere to objective principles and common interests, and we want to avoid creating a situation that would compel the Russians to have to go into eastern Ukraine. But it became quite obvious that wasn't going to happen. We know that the war continued. We know that the war started in Ukraine in 2014. There's no question about that. Among people who followed this, and that it was being escalated through the various administrations, including the Trump first administration, and that by 2021 or so, they had concluded that they were prepared. They were prepared for the next phase of this. So, as Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande said, the Minsk agreements were basically just to buy some time to build up the Ukrainian military forces.
Yep.
And so from the Russian point of view, it was in fact war being planned, and they knew that the U.S. was going to come in. There right before the movement into eastern Ukraine, we know that a week before that, there was probes taking place along the line of contact. And then they were dropping in the U.S. media and Western media the propaganda point that, look, if you hear about certain kinds of exchanges of military action between Ukraine and the Russians, it's propaganda that basically is not Ukraine, but is in fact the Russians. So in some ways, the Russians preempted what was going to be an inevitable a movement on the part of Ukrainian forces, and to avoid being pushed back and trapped up against their borders. I know I went into a whole lot of detail. It wasn't necessary.
You're perfectly fine.
This
detail is fine.
Yeah.
No, you're perfectly fine.
Yeah. So basically, these lessons were learned by the Russian Federation, and so when they have, and I think that the U.S. side, and let's remember now, Trump is not an independent actor. As much as he has attempted to expand the power of the executive, Trump is still constrained by objective interests in the U.S. that are much more powerful than the presidency. Okay, and so he was not going to risk the all-out war with the Russian Federation. But what we see today is a recognition that as a consequence of the Russian Federation sticking to its demands regarding how this conflict would end, they have not been susceptible to the kinds of bluster and bluffing coming from the U.S. side. But what the Trump administration needs to understand is that there's a narrative developing now that is not too favorable to the U.S. That Trump will bluff and engage in bluster and then back down. That
Yeah.
undermines his tough guy image, and so it's counterproductive to continue with this.
Yeah, taco Trump, right? Trump always, what is it? Trump always calls it off something. I forget the
Something like
acronym
that,
for it.
but it's bad.
Yeah, it makes you look. It's why I always said the U.S.'s interests. It doesn't really care about the actual contours of certain things. Like, I mean, the U.S. has an interest in overextending Russia. It has an interest in giving weapons and everything to Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily care about the internal dynamics between these two, where Russia considers it existential. Meaning they don't get into the details. We don't get into the weeds. We have interests. We're a hegemon. We're a superpower, right? That's the way we think. And on this one, I think we're bumping our heads on this and on China, where it's like, no, which is a new norm in a way that the U.S. operates, where it seems to be grotesquely unfamiliar in dealing with peers, but they're learning. They're learning the hard way. Hopefully, we don't end up in a larger war for it. I want to move to the Caribbean for a bit.
Yeah.
I find this to be a degradation of society as represented by the office of the president itself. Listen to a response that Trump made to a question on Venezuela. I personally, I don't think presidents should curse in public, but that's me being old.
Maduro offered everything in his country, all the natural resources. He even recorded a message to you in English recently, offering mediation. What could he do in order to stop that?
He has offered everything. He's offered everything. You're right. You know why? Because he doesn't want to fuck around with the United States. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah. I think I think that story was a little bit exaggerated. I think in the course of conversations between the Venezuelan government and the U.S. government, they were exploring what are the kinds of agreements that they might be able to come to terms with that could de-escalate the situation. But in typical fashion, coming from the U.S., this was seen as both a weakness and an opportunity.
Yes.
And the opportunity was to share this with the world, to indicate that they were basically ready to surrender and to undermine confidence in some of their major supporters, that the Venezuelan government would, if necessary, sell out their interests also. So it was very slick a move on the part of the U.S. But look, it's quite clear that there is an intent here to lay the foundation for the justification of a military strike on Venezuela with the clear objective of so-called regime change. And what is the objective here? Clearly not any concern about crime or the drug flow from Latin America into the U.S. It's about regime change. And what is interesting, I think, and sad too, is the ease in which they can create this justification. Falling back on the old crime trope, and the notion of the U.S. being overwhelmed by the drugs coming from this narco state. And it's understandable that many people in the center or even the right would fall for that. But what is really disheartening is the ease in which even left forces fall for that and abandon the principles of national sovereignty. That basically whatever contradictions or whatever you may perceive in the Venezuelan process is their process. And the U.S. has no objective right to interfere into the internal processes of any nation on this planet. And then when you don't adhere to the principles of self-determination and national sovereignty, then you are objectively aligning yourself with the interests of the imperialist project. You've got to understand that and make a choice. But I think many so-called leftists in the U.S. and in the West have made a choice, and their choice is to stand with Western imperialism. And so this is a contradiction that for us who are in the center, in the crosshairs of the colonial projects coming from the U.S. and the Western European forces, it shows to us that we have some shaky allies in the West because we stand forthright in the principles of self-determination and sovereignty. We may have issues and see certain kind of contradictions, but we understand that there is a certain kind of dynamic, a certain kind of motion taking place. We stick with the Americas. That's fairly progressive, and that we're not going to undermine or support the undermining of a Venezuela in favor of what? This right-wing individual who they gave the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. This is the extreme right in the Venezuela process. These are freaks. These are criminals. And you're talking about a bloodbath. That's what would occur if these people were forced into the Venezuela situation. Plus, too, it'll be completely delegitimized. People have to understand or remember, or maybe just understand the history of U.S. interventions in Latin America, such that there is this super sensitivity to U.S. interventions. And any state that will openly align itself with an interventionist strategy is going to be delegitimized. And that the only way they're going to be able to maintain themselves is a real dictatorship, a vicious dictatorship, which of course is part of the reason why there's so much rejection of U.S. interventions, because people in Latin America remember very closely what they went through with these U.S. imposed military dictatorships across the continent. So this is a failed strategy. They may have the ability to intervene into Venezuela, to force the government to evacuate the capital, perhaps, but they cannot win in Venezuela. And people have to understand, if you are concerned about war and warmongering, then you've got to take a more principled, a clear-headed stance on this issue of what is unfolding in Venezuela. Look, the U.S. understands Venezuela is key to the entire America's region. That if you have a free Venezuela able to take advantage of the 303 billion barrels of petroleum that they have access to. I mean, look at the kind of weight and influence that these little monarchies have from the UAE, Qatar, and the Saudis. You know, if the Venezuelans were allowed to operate under normal global economic conditions, then they have the resources to be able to support the projects that we know are in place and unfolding. That is very, very progressive, in fact, even radical. And the U.S. authorities understand that. And that's why for them, it's not just a question of regional hegemony for the U.S., but basically the global balance of forces.
You would think that after weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that the public would be more skeptical of a president just making it up.
I think so.
I mean, Trump is literally, with not one law to back it up, just murdering Venezuelans in a boat and claiming that we're supposed to believe the habitual liar, that these are drug dealers, quote unquote, as if it would be okay, even if they were. And he's been doing this to Venezuelans, Colombians. Apparently there was somebody from Trinidad and Tobago on one of those boats. Are you shocked that there's not more backlash to this in the States? I mean, it seems to be an anesthetized population where it's like, well, Trump is murdering people in the Caribbean. And they're like, okay, well, he's murdering people in the Caribbean. Oh, well.
I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in left forces that are not raising more serious questions and demonstrating more obvious opposition to this. As you said, the legal basis of it is dubious at best.
That's
They have indicated that there is legal justification for this by dusting off certain provisions around enemy combatants and these individuals representing a clear threat to the U.S. homeland. That gives the Trump administration the right to engage in extrajudicial executions. We got to remind ourselves too, though. This is important, and this is, people say it's what about it, but it's not. It's about having a perspective that properly contextualizes the historical moment. We might remember that the Obama administration, they murdered 3 U.S. citizens. Okay,
Yes, they did.
and the question was raised. Well, what gives a U.S. president the right to order an extrajudicial murder of a U.S. citizen? Well, they say, well, we gave them due process. What kind of due process? Well, there was a due process that was supposedly done within the context of the Justice Department, in which they looked at the rights of these individuals and then determined, well, we do have a right to kill them,
Yep.
without a trial, including a 16-year-old child.
Yep.
So the foundations of this gradual move towards fascism, we have to remind people constantly, has been laid over the last decade or so. Okay. And so while the Trump administration is the most dramatic in their expressions of using the power of the executive, the political and ideological foundations were being laid for quite some time. Look, the whole Russian Gate BS. What was that? That was basically providing a justification for the state to determine, what kind of information, what kind of speech was allowable. And conditioning people to accept the state making those kinds of determinations. So then we end up having things like misinformation and all of this kind of nonsense. We saw this alignment or this alliance that took place between the state and big tech and regulating speech and information and thought on social media platforms. These were the foundations being laid. And this use now of, for example, of state power to legally go after your opponents. Lawfare applied in the U.S. started under the Democrats.
Yes.
What was the whole movement against the Trump forces?
Yes.
You had the FBI raiding the house of a former president in the midst of a conversation or a discussion, a negotiation that they were having between the former president and the government around what documents were going to be allowable for him to retain. In the midst of those conversations, they decided they're going to raid his house. Look, it's just silliness. Okay, we got to put this stuff in perspective, because if you don't, you end up inadvertently providing a rationale, a justification for supporting the Democrat Party as an opposition that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist.
Agreed.
These folks are not opposed to the consolidation of fascism in this country. The movement toward fascism has been a decision that was made by the ruling elements. They tried the soft power with Barack Obama. They tried centrist policies under Biden, and they decided they are going to abandon liberal democracy, the liberal framework, because now it's a yoke in terms of their ability to try to maintain the hegemony, and they're going with a fascist consolidation under Trump. These are objective. These are objective interests, objective conditions. It has nothing to do with the mentality, the psychology of Donald Trump. This is a class program.
Do you think? Yes, agreed. First and foremost, agreed. Do you think part of that is based on the way the American system is arranged? Like, we have this rugged individualism. We have this idea of this kind of capitalistic system, this hyper-capitalistic system, where that soaks into the very DNA of a person in regards to the way that they value the world, value other people. That it is very difficult over time to, let's say, instill a value set of commonality and common purpose when everything else pushes in the direction of you're an individual, period. Then you get the fracturing of people's and their point of view on social media. So if whatever my point of view is, I can just read that or watch that. I don't have to listen to other people's point of view. I can exist in my bubble as an individual within the context of that bubble. Meaning, it seems that many of the elements of the way America is arranged pulls against this idea of some kind of common purpose, in which case you almost need, and this is not me calling for this, but I'm saying it can be understood why this kind of fascist hammer will come down in the sense of we must maintain the integrity of the state and the integrity of the country. And the way we maintain the integrity of the country is through this kind of fascist overhaul in the way that we operate. Meaning this may go beyond just Trump. This may go into a program that is being employed. Give me your take on that.
I definitely think it's a program that's going to continue because look, what is fascism? Fascism is basically a capitalist reform. It is a move on the part of the ruling capitalist class to create and support a politics that will allow for capitalism to continue. It's quite clear that the shelf life of capital is really already up, and we see the results of that globally. With the so-called Gen Z protests taking place in various countries around the world. And what are they protesting? They're protesting the inability of their capitalist economies in their particular national environments to provide for them a humane existence, one in which their fundamental human rights are being recognized and fulfilled. And the issue is this. There is no reconciliation of these internal capitalist contradictions because capitalism cannot provide the kind of prosperity that people are looking for. It cannot in its present form. And therefore it is stuck, but it has determined that the way it continues itself is through the use of military means and violence, the continuation of state and structured violence in order to maintain its hegemony. So these are the kind of tensions that will continue, despite whoever is sitting in the white people's house in 2028. That this continues. This commitment to global white supremacy is going to continue. How else can we explain? Going to your earlier question in terms of how we can live with the slaughter of Gaza and not learn. Well, how do you explain the slaughter of Gaza? These people, these Palestinian human beings, were perceived to be less than human, and therefore they were killable. And the Western powers set back and allowed for this to happen. There's no systematic sanctions placed on the Israelis. There's no systematic opposition coming from the highest forms of government in the U.S. In fact, when the young people on the college campuses, primarily at the elite schools, that is, their sons and daughters, begin to oppose the genocide, what happens? They feel the full weight of the repressive apparatus. Okay, so these are the terms of struggle people need to understand. That basically, when you allow for humanity to be divided between the humans and the non-humans, then those non-humans are in fact killable, and that's what we are finding with the extrajudicial executions taking place off the coast of Venezuela. Instead of people being interdicted and given a chance to be with the assumption of to be innocent until proven guilty, they are murdered. They are the U.S. that has abrogated to itself the right of being the judge, jury, and executioner, and can get away with it. It's all right. Who cares about the lives of Venezuelans? If the images that we saw coming out of Gaza with starving children, with people being tortured, if that would have been in a European nation, that war would have been over in 2 days. It wouldn't have been tolerated. But we can go 2 years of people being burned to death, tortured, bombed, traumatized, starved. And now the Israeli fascists have now decided they're going to stop the entry of aid going into Gaza. How can you explain the continuation of this if you don't bring in the element of white supremacy and racism? Again, I know people don't want to deal with this because it's divisive or whatever, but we can't play with this any longer. You can't talk about trying to build an effective opposition if you don't deal with these internal issues. If you don't deal with the fact that how is it that so many people in the West will identify with white power, basically, and allow for the murder of Palestinians, who will fall for the trope of criminality in Haiti and support the intervention of the U.S., in essence, into Haiti to undermine the political process, because these wild black people in Haiti, They don't represent a legitimate political struggle. They're not struggling for a real self-determination and democracy. They're just criminals and being subjected to the activities of so-called criminal gangs. And people fall for it and fail for it. So we have to now educate, our friends in Colombia, our friends in Mexico, that this is not a legitimate move on the part of the United Nations. This gang suppression resolution that was passed in the United Nations last week. This is the continuation of a plan, a project spearheaded by the U.S. to basically undermine democracy in Haiti. So all of these things are interconnected, and they all can be explained not only in terms of the objective colonial capitalist interest, but the ideological justification for it, which is grounded in white supremacy.
Only thing I would quibble with the entire statement was not just allowed it, supported it, backed it, paid money for it, put weapons into it. Meaning Europe didn't just sit like, oh, that sucks. Europe was actually contributing to that stuff. I mean,
Exactly.
they were all in on the genocide. I mean, let's be honest, right? It's not just the U.S. colony; it's also a colony of Europeans, and so
Which basically all of them are now complicit, because
yes,
you have Article 3 under the Genocide Convention, Section E. It says basically you can be indicted for complicity with genocide. These states have a responsibility to have not only prevented genocide, but now they have a responsibility to deal with the issue of punishment. But instead, they supported, as you said, they supported the genocide. All of the nations that continued providing economic support in terms of even trade relationships, they have some serious questions to deal with, because that could be, in fact, interpreted as complicity with this genocide.
see, that's the
So
rub.
this whole Gaza thing is I think a turning point. A turning point
Gaza,
not only in terms of undermining, exposing the limitations of Western morality, but raising questions about the international system itself.
yeah, Gaza was a wake up call. It was a wake up call for me because I sat there like we were watching kids get ritualistically murdered on a
Yes.
daily basis, and you think to yourself, okay, well, and I've always made this argument: international law doesn't exist. I was proven right in that point. I mean, otherwise, that can't necessarily take place. I realized that the whole think about never again. The reality of it is the only reason the world cared about the Holocaust the first time around was because we fought a war with the Germans and we needed to stick it to the Germans, not because we cared about the population itself. Meaning, governments are realist governments. They look at a situation and they think to themselves, how much do we want to expend to get involved in that situation? If it doesn't affect them, then they don't care.
Mhm.
I guess I didn't realize it before. Maybe that's stupid me. I realize it now. And so you get the majority of the world that just watched and continued its trade relationship with Israel as Israel was continuing this genocide. And yes, I know the United States paid the lion's share of that money and the weapons and everything else and political support. But still, let's be honest, the rest of the world effectively sat there and watched.
But let me push back on that though. See, I've been tempted to sort of modify that position on the rest of the world. I think it's important to say that in the global South that represents the majority of humanity, there was no confusion on what we were watching in Gaza.
Yes.
The issue is that in the Western world, where they have in fact the power to be able to do something about that, that is the part of humanity that allowed that to continue. That sat back and in fact watched. And again, I argue that happened because of the inability to identify with these human beings. Now, everybody didn't do that, of course, because we had these courageous young people in the U.S. We have people across Western Europe and even in parts of the U.S. That took forthright principled positions in opposition to the genocide. So everybody wasn't impacted. Everybody in the West is not condemnable, but the governmental representatives and powerful forces in the West that had the ability to put a stop to this, they did nothing. In fact, they did the opposite. The U.S. vetoed a ceasefire in Gaza how many times? 6 times or so. So yeah, they are all implicated. But yeah, no, I think we need to make a division between the world and the West.
That's fair. Yeah, this is my Western chauvinism coming out of me on this one. No, you're absolutely right. Not everybody in the world agree with this. The majority of the world, or large part of the world, effectively understood. No, you're absolutely right. Where do you think, just to go back to the Venezuela thing before we close, where do you think that goes? How far do you think Trump goes with that? Is this a pressure campaign? Or do you think there's a clip where the United States has been militarizing Puerto Rico, where they have like
Yeah.
all of this military hardware and everything else in Puerto Rico as if they're trying to threaten a strike? Considering the degree of anesthesia that the American public seems to be on with all of this taking place, because this is amazing. And I'm not one of those people that believe that the left, quote unquote, or let's say people who would vote for Joe Biden or the Democrats are the left. I mean, they look at this stuff, they're just as imperialist as anything. If you have a Democratic hands on the tiller, they are perfectly okay with what's taking place. Meaning, if this was Joe Biden doing it, they would not be complaining about it under any circumstances. They're militarizing Puerto Rico. How far
Yes.
do you think to go with this? I mean, do you think that this really is a regime change operation, or do you think it's a pressure campaign with the idea of working with internal elements? And maybe there's not a difference in those things. But do you think
No,
that
I
they're
think
US
that
strikes?
they're going past the pressure campaign. I think that I think that they are moving toward a real strike. And I think the only thing that could put a brake on this would be if there was effective internal opposition, meaning opposition within the U.S. and by extension in the West.
Mm,
Unfortunately, that's not happening. So this is a very dangerous situation for the government and the people of Venezuela, because you have the U.S. basically operating as a rogue state, and
yes.
there's no constraints on this state. And so they want that 303 billion barrels of oil that Venezuela has. And they want the oil in Guyana. And the authorities of the state in Guyana doesn't seem to understand that. That basically you are going to lose whatever little sovereignty you have if that in fact occurs, if so-called regime change takes place in Venezuela. So no, I think unfortunately we are facing a very dangerous situation. That's why many of us are racing, trying to help people to understand the terms. Yes, Puerto Rico is important. See, this issue with them using Puerto Rico as a forward deployment area raises again the question of Puerto Rican independence. You know, there's a very strong independence movement that's now have been revived in the last few years. And
Yeah.
it's important that again, we support that, you know, but again, you got this goofy ass left that doesn't seem to understand the terms of these struggles. Puerto Rico has to be independent. And we connect Puerto Rico independence with the independence of Haiti. You know, both of these are connected. And that's one of the reasons why the Black Alliance of Peace, we have been racing for the last couple of years, trying to develop this campaign on making the Americas a zone of peace. We're trying to develop what we refer to as an American-wide consciousness. That those of us who live in North America, you part of the Americas, you know, and so basically our interests, those of us who are colonized in the North American context, we have an objective interest in affiliating with and being part of this anti-colonial struggle that's taking place in the Americas. And we can't allow for the U.S. to be able to assert itself in these repressive ways in our region. And so we are calling for a zone of peace in response to what the call that was made in 2014 by the community of Latin America and Caribbean states. We have to popularize that campaign. We say we must eject the U.S. from our region because all they're bringing to our region is death and destruction. So that's why we are pushing this campaign. It's an anti-imperialist campaign, and we need it today more than any other time. So yes, we are building opposition, and there will be opposition. We don't know if we're going to have the effective forces yet to stop this attack. The one thing that did happen, and this is important, is now the Trump administration has now connected Colombia to
Yes.
his orbit of repression, you know, and that's a very important and interesting kind of move because Colombia is key also in this region. And so You know, this is a development that is really laying out a new terrain in terms of how the struggle for Latin American independence is going to play out over the next few months and next couple of years.
Yes, everything you just said, I agree. Ajamu Baraka, man, thank you for this. When you responded to my email, I was so I was so excited, right? I voted for you. By the way, you was down when you guys ran. So no, I followed your career for a while, ever since you were running in that election, and I really appreciate you joining me. And I hope you come back. I really do.
I appreciate it. Let's do it again. We just touched the surface.
Absolutely. Ajamu Baraka, he is an international human rights activist, organizer, political analyst. He is national organizer for Black Agenda for Peace. And you have a fantastic rest of your day, man. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.